Good evening. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all tonight to our lecture series, The United States and World Affairs, the Cold War and Beyond. I'm pleased to see all of you back here. Our speaker tonight is Professor Stephen Rabe of the University of Texas at Dallas. He is one of the nation's foremost historians on relations between the United States and Latin America. I'm Klaus Lares. I'm the Richard M. Krasno Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs here at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. I would like to thank our generous sponsors again for supporting the lecture series this semester. We have a YouTube channel, as you may know, and this features our two lecture series, the Ambassadors Forum and the Cold War and the United States and World Affairs, the Cold War and Beyond. Please be so kind as to subscribe to our channel and to watch all our interesting talks and lectures as often as you possibly can. And we also now have a Twitter account, and I know you're all into Twittering, so please subscribe to that channel as well. That is twitter.com/KrasnoEventsUNC, all in one word. As you may know, historians and political scientists don't really talk to each other, each feeling superior to the other. Tonight, however, as a special treat for you, I have made an exception. I would like to introduce my eminent colleague from the Political Science Department here at UNC, Professor Lars Schoultz, the William Rand Keenan Professor. Professor Schoultz is an outstanding expert on inter-American relations and on the history of Latin American relations. He has many publications to his name, including books on Argentina and Cuba. Professor Schoultz will later ask our speaker some very tough questions. As you know, U.S. relations with its neighbors in the south, the countries of Latin America, have been, let's say, complex and difficult, to put it mildly. Only recently we have learned about the sort of normalizations of relations with Cuba, just a mere 53 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis. After the Communist Revolution in Russia in 1917, it took the United States 16 years to recognize the Soviet Union, a slightly more dangerous and powerful country. It has taken more than 5 decades to recognize the tiny island of Cuba, and I'm sure we will hear about that later in our lecture today. And of course, U.S. relations during the Cold War with other Latin American countries have been complex and difficult, and American involvement in the military coups and their bloody aftermath in, for example, Guatemala, Chile, El Salvador, and many other countries in Latin America are well known. Yet, U.S. relations with Latin America during the Cold War are still in need of lots of historical research. Lots of new documents are being dug up almost daily, and historians need to make sense of that and find out more. And I'm happy to say that some of our best graduate students here at UNC are actually in the process of doing so, and they are investigating partially relations between Latin America and the United States during the Cold War. I'm very pleased tonight that Professor Stephen Rabe has joined us. Steve is probably America's leading historian on United States relations with Latin America during the Cold War. He also is a very nice man and a very good speaker. Steve Rabe holds the Ashbel Smith Chair in History at the University of Texas in Dallas. He has written and edited 11 scholarly books, including The Killing Zone, The United States Wages Cold War in Latin America, then also John F. Kennedy, World Leader, and also, for example, Eisenhower and Latin America, the foreign policy of anti-communism. This book won the Bernard Book Prize from Schaeffer, the Society of Historians of American Foreign Relations. Steve has also written many other books, such as the well-known book on OPEC and Venezuela, as well as many, many scholarly articles. But Steve Rabe does not just like to write books and articles, he also likes to travel a lot. He has lectured and taught in over 20 countries, including in Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, Ecuador, as well as in Ireland, Northern Ireland, Finland, and many, many other countries. Steve has received many grants and fellowships from important research institutions. He has also won 3 awards for distinguished teaching at the University of Texas in Dallas. And according to his website, since 1977, he seems to have taught perhaps more undergraduate students than any other professor in the University of Texas at Dallas. Steve is also a veteran of the U.S. Marine Corps. Today, Steve Rabe will talk about torture, murder, and genocide. Cold War Memories in Latin America and the United States. After his talk, Professor Lars Schoultz and I will interrogate Steve Rabe a little, and then we will open it up to questions from you, the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Professor Steve Rabe to UNC Chapel Hill tonight.
Well, I'm very, very happy to be here, and I'm very glad that such a large number of people turned out on such a kind of dreary evening. I left from Dallas yesterday where it was 80 degrees and quite warm and sunny, and it was quite a shock to arrive today. So this is what I'm going to do. We got two or three things. Obviously, you heard that I was going to be interrogated, so I do, and being a smart Marine, I have my Kevlar vest on, so I'm ready for that. But before I'm assaulted, there are a couple of things I want to do. One is I'm going to read a paper. It'll take about 40 minutes. I recognize that that's not the best form of communication. But since it is about murder, torture, and genocide, you'll probably remember what I'm going to say. And of course, a lot of the things are relatively disturbing. Then I have some 27 slides that I want to show you, or photos that I've taken to kind of put some flesh and blood on the people and institutions that we'll be speaking about. And then, of course, we'll have the interrogation. And then I will certainly stay here, to use the Bill Clinton expression, till the last dog dies. I never quite knew what he meant by that, but it was always I like that expression, that I'll stay and answer any question that anybody has. Okay? So, and I might just say, again, about North Carolina, I have a couple connections to North Carolina. One is that 3 of my books were published by the University of North Carolina Press. And in addition, where I go, the University of Texas at Dallas, we are the fastest, where I teach at the University of Texas at Dallas, we are the fastest growing university in the United States. We're adding about 2,000 students a year. When I started there in 1977, we had 3,500 students taking about 6 hours. We've just had juniors, seniors, and grad students. And because the Dallas-Fort Worth area, of course, is growing very rapidly, we've grown along with it. And so now we're up to 23,000 students, and probably we will have 30,000 students by the end of the decade. But one of our models, and what our president holds up as our model, is the University of North Carolina. That we have students with very high SAT scores, and he holds us, NorthU, up as a model for us to try to emulate. That we'd like to get to 30,000 students and hold it there, whether we can or not, and then develop programs much like the University of North Carolina. We do have one difference at UT Dallas between the University of North Carolina and ourselves, in that our football team remains undefeated and untied. And may it always be so. May it always be so. Okay. First, the introduction. The Cold War proved a gruesome time for Latin America. In the 4 decades that followed the overthrow of the constitutional government of President Jacobo Arbenz in 1954, over 200,000 Guatemalans perished in political violence. In tiny El Salvador, over 75,000 citizens died, principally during the 1980s. Over 500,000 citizens fled the country, and another 500,000 were internally displaced by the political violence. Warfare ravaged Nicaragua during the 1970s and 1980s. On a per capita basis, Nicaragua lost more citizens during its Cold War than did the United States in the Civil War and all of its international wars combined. General Efraín Ríos Montt directed between 1982 and 1983 the slaughter of 40,000 Guatemalans, principally Mayan people. Cruelty, death, and destruction were not limited to Central America. During La Guerra Sucia, or the Dirty War, of the late 1970s, the Argentine military and associated death squads massacred 30,000 Argentines. Many of the dead assumed the title of desaparecido, or disappeared. The victims, usually alive, were often dumped into the frigid South Atlantic from airplanes and helicopters. The forces of repression did not, however, achieve their goals. Argentine military officers boasted of plans to kill 50,000 people. General Augusto Pinochet and his minions did not ring up extraordinary death tolls in Chile. Pinochet's acolytes specialized in incarceration and torture. Scholars estimate that 100,000 Chileans were tortured while in the hands of Pinochet's security forces. Another 200,000 fled the terror and went into exile. This in a population of 10 million people. Michelle Bachelet, the popular and successful president of Chile, endured the horror. Her father, a Chilean general, died of a heart attack after being tortured. As a young woman, Bachelet was abused by the Chilean military. Putting a human face on this agony, telling the disturbing stories of the non-elite victims and their loved ones would take a long time. But evocative examples abound. Argentine parents had delivered to them by security forces the body of their daughter with rats sewn inside her vagina. Rahelia Cruz Martinez, an architecture student, leftist, and former Miss Guatemala in the Miss Universe contest, suffered a similar hideous fate in 1968. Her butchers publicly displayed Cruz's mutilated and raped naked corpse. Ronnie Moffett drowned her own blood after her carotid artery and windpipe were severed by shrapnel. Moffett, a U.S. citizen, was accompanying Orlando Letelier, the former foreign minister of Chile, in a car in Washington, D.C. in 1976. Agents of the Chilean security force, known as DINA, D-I-N-A, operating under the aegis of the international terrorist network dubbed Operation Condor, detonated a remote control bomb that killed Letelier and Moffett. Rafina Amaya Marquez witnessed the decapitation of her husband and heard her children scream for help in the village of El Mozote in El Salvador. Her husband and 4 children were among the 800 massacred by security forces in December 1981. Jose Laboro Poblete and his wife were tortured and then disappeared under the direction of the notorious Argentine Sergeant Julian Simon. The couple was disabled, with Jose having lost his legs in an automobile accident. The torturers taunted Jose, calling him Cortito, or Shorty, and turned him into a bowling ball, rolling him down flights of stairs. Argentine security forces compounded the grief of the couple's relatives by kidnapping the couple's baby, Claudia, renaming her, and giving her to an Argentine military family. Poblete's crime of subversion had been that he had written a petition calling on Argentine companies to hire a fixed percentage of disabled workers. Remarkably, political activists who were hunted down by right-wing security forces have gained political power in the 21st century. In addition to former President Bachelet of Chile, there's President Jose Mujica of Uruguay. Mujica was tortured during his 14 years as a political prisoner in Uruguayan jails. And Dilma Rousseff is president of Brazil. In 1970, at the age of 22, Rousseff was incarcerated in a military prison, stripped naked, bound upside down, and administered electric shocks to her breasts, inner thighs, and head. This radical evil, to use Kant's words, that darkened Latin America during the Cold War was perpetrated largely by military dictatorships and their allied death squads. Various international investigative bodies, or truth commissions, established that depending on the country, Guatemala, El Salvador, Chile, or Argentina, the forces of the extreme right bore responsibility for 83 to 99% of the violence. During the Cold War, the United States covertly aided military officers in their seizure of power and then publicly supported them with weapons and counterinsurgency training. In the pursuit of Cold War, the United States destabilized governments in Argentina, Brazil, British Guiana, Bolivia, Chile, the Dominican Republic, Ecuador, El Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua, and Uruguay. It tried but failed to destabilize 2 other countries, Cuba and Haiti. It also worked to strengthen repressive military-dominated regimes, like the Honduras of the 1980s, and police states like the Uruguay of the 1970s. Now, the purpose of this talk is not to recount the Cold War in Latin America, but to examine how Latin Americans and U.S. citizens have chosen to remember it. Latin America and the United States have reacted in different ways to the end of the Cold War. For Latin Americans, coming to terms with the meaning of the Cold War has been an ongoing process that has stretched into the 21st century. Latin Americans have established commissions to establish the facts of what happened to their societies. For more than 2 decades, Latin Americans have been looking to locate their dead and find their missing children. Latin Americans have also gradually concluded they must prosecute the perpetrators of evil if they are to achieve peace and closure in their societies. Nunca más, never again, has become a rallying cry in the region. The breaching of the Berlin Wall in November 1989 and the subsequent collapse of the Soviet Union have not, however, prompted a similar pattern of reflection and soul-searching in the United States. The joy and satisfaction over the newfound freedom of Eastern Europeans has superseded any qualms about the hurt and pain inflicted upon Cold War bystanders. U.S. officials have have issued scattered apologies for Cold War decisions that destroyed the lives of Latin Americans. But no agency of the U.S. government has conducted a systematic assessment of the U.S. role in Latin America during the Cold War. However reluctantly, agencies like the CIA have gradually and incompletely complied with scholarly demands to release the documentary record. The release of records has not, however, prompted a public discussion about the past. Discussion of the U.S. war in Latin America is largely confined to the scholarly community. So, first, Latin American Cold War history. Argentina, the home of the Guerra Sucia, has led the way in historical inquiry. The generals and admirals that had murdered 30,000 Argentines left office in disgrace after the military debacle that was the war to liberate the Malvinas. Argentina's anti-communist military leaders had demonstrated to the world that their leadership skills and competence was limited to torturing and murdering defenseless civilians. In 1983, Argentines elected Raul Alfonsín of the Radical Party as president. Since the election of President Alfonsín, Argentines have been able to maintain a constitutional system and civilian rule. President Alfonsín established a commission to establish the truth about state terrorism in Argentina. In 1984, the commission issued its report from hell, Nunca Más. The report documented 340 secret detention centers and about 9,000 disappeared persons. The report further concluded that the number of disappeared was substantially higher than 9,000. The report also indicted the military's national security doctrines, labeling them as totalitarian. Chile, El Salvador, and Guatemala would issue similar reports in the 1990s on atrocities during the Cold War. As Argentines began the search for the desaparecidos in mass graves, they developed forensic skills in exhuming and identifying bodies. Argentine anthropologists thereafter assisted other nations in Latin America in recovering and identifying remains. Argentine anthropologists have been involved very recently in Mexico, helping to find the 43 students that have disappeared. President Alfonsín authorized the prosecution of junta members who terrorized Argentina from 1976 to 82. A panel of judges in a federal appellate court found 5 of the junta members guilty and sentenced them to prison. General Jorge Videla and Admiral Emilio Massera received life sentences. Facing an increasingly mutinous and disloyal military, President Alfonsín decided to accept punto fino, or final point, and due obedience laws that would sharply curtail prosecutions. The due obedience law exempted military personnel below the rank of colonel from prosecution. The Argentine president reasoned that he had to prevent another military golpe and safeguard Argentine constitutionalism. Arguing that Argentina needed to move forward, President Carlos Saúl Menem, Alfonsín's successor, pardoned the convicted officers and those who had been indicted. Impunity had seemingly triumphed over justice in Argentina. Domestic and international developments combined to lead Argentines from the late 1990s on once again to reassess their Cold War past. Argentines were left aghast when in 1995, Captain Adolfo Salingo confessed on a popular TV news show that he had participated in 2 of the weekly death flights, dumping 30 living but drugged desaparecidos into the South Atlantic. The articulate Salingo, who was now conscience-stricken, appeared handsome, educated, socially adept, and well-groomed. Less visually appealing on TV, but equally horrifying, was the torturer Julio Simón, known as Julian the Turk. Simón, who attached a big swastika to his watch chain, would listen to operatic music before commencing his torture sessions. He favored pushing sticks up the victims' anuses while shocking them with 220 volts of electricity. Speaking directly to the camera, the unrepentant Simón said, quote, "The norm was to kill everyone, and anyone kidnapped was tortured." Such revelations helped push Argentines into action. The Argentines received support in their quest for justice from the international legal community. Growing out of memories of the Holocaust, the principles of the Nuremberg trials, the adoption of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, and the continued atrocities in places such as East Pakistan, Cambodia, Bosnia, and Rwanda, international lawyers began to argue that there was a quote-unquote universal jurisdiction for crimes against humanity. Belgium adopted a law in 1993 giving its legal system jurisdiction over war crimes anywhere in the world. Italian and Spanish jurists initiated extradition proceedings against Latin American military officers. In the first decade of the 21st century, Argentine jurists pursued the criminals who waged La Guerra Sucia. In 2001, an Argentine federal judge ruled the punto final and due obedience laws unconstitutional, reasoning that they violated both Argentine and international law. The court's judgment received political support from President Nestor Kirchner and his successor and wife, Cristina. The government decreed that the torture center that was the Navy School of Mechanics in Buenos Aires would be transformed into a space for memory and the defense of human rights. Both the prominent and unpublicized perpetrators of murder and torture in Argentina faced justice. In 2002, General Leopoldo Galtieri was again indicted and put under house arrest. He died a few months later of a heart attack. In 2006, Julian the Turk received a 25-year sentence for the torture of the disabled couple and the theft of their child. In 2010, an Argentine court convicted Reinaldo Bignone, a retired general and Argentina's last dictator, for the kidnapping, torture, and murder of 56 people. Bignone, who was 82, received a 25-year sentence. In 2013, the military dictator, General Jorge Videla, died in the Marcos Paz prison in Buenos Aires. In 2010, General Videla received a life sentence for the murder of 31 political prisoners. Human rights activists also celebrated the life sentence handed down in 2007 to the Reverend Christian von Wernick, a Roman Catholic priest. Father von Wernick was present at torture sessions, helping extract confessions, while at the same time offering consoling words to family members seeking their loved ones who had been kidnapped. The conviction forced both lay people and religious people to confront the church's complicity in Argentina's sordid past. Argentine religious leaders had not publicly opposed oppression, as they had in Brazil, Chile, and El Salvador. One notable exception, however, had been Enrique Angelelli, the Bishop of La Rioja. In 1976, Bishop Angelelli, who defended the rights of the poor, died in an automobile crash, which military authorities described as an accident. Angelelli's parishioners kept his memory alive for decades, praising him as a martyr. In July 2014, a court in the city of La Rioja found 2 former senior military officers guilty of murder and sentenced them to life in prison. The military dictatorship had orchestrated the bishop's death, forcing his car off the road on a deserted highway. In 2006, to commemorate the 30th anniversary of Monsignor Angelelli's martyrdom, Argentina's leading prelate, Cardinal Bergoglio, delivered a homily in the Cathedral of La Rioja that endorsed the Christian nature of Angelelli's defense of the oppressed. In March 2013, the College of Cardinals in Rome elevated Bergoglio to the papacy. The new pope took the name of Francis I. Allegations almost immediately appeared that as the Jesuit provincial superior for Argentina in the 1970s, Bergoglio had not done all he could either to protect two Jesuit subordinates from torture or to protest the murderous ways of military rulers. Whatever the merits of those allegations, Pope Francis has joined in the movement to rectify Cold War injustices. He lifted the hold on the beatification of Archbishop Oscar Romero of El Salvador. Conservative leaders in the church had blocked the beatification process of Romero, who was assassinated in 1980. Pope Francis praised Romero as a quote-unquote man of God. The Pope's ruling suggested that martyrdom be extended not just to those who died for their faith, but also to those to those killed because they were doing God's work. The Pope has also done a whole variety of other things. Miguel de Escoto in Nicaragua was a priest who was defrocked by Pope John Paul II because he had participated in the Sandinista government and refused to leave the government. De Escoto is very elderly, and he asked the Pope if he could return to the priesthood because he wanted to say Mass before he died, and the Pope granted that to him. International jurists also contributed to the movement for justice. Italian courts have an ongoing investigation of Operation Condor. In 1990, a jury in France convicted in absentia Navy Captain Alfredo Astiz for the disappearance of 2 French nuns. The nuns had been working with Argentine groups, including the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, in trying to learn about the fate of the disappeared. Captain Astiz, who was known as the Angel of Death, or the Blonde Angel of Death, for his youthful appearance, blonde hair, and ruthlessness, had infiltrated the peace groups, claiming that he had a brother who had also disappeared. On 8 December 1977, acting on intelligence gathered by Astiz, military thugs abducted 13 of the mothers, including the founder of the group. They and the French nuns were tortured and then tossed into the South Atlantic. In late 2009, Argentine jurists began the process of putting Captain Astiz on trial for murder and subsequently convicted him to life imprisonment for crimes against humanity in 2011. The reunification of the perhaps 500 kidnapped children with their grandparents has been a wrenching process for the victims. These were the children born in prison to abducted mothers who were subsequently murdered by the Argentine military. The grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo had identified by mid-2014 114 of the children, some of whom have integrated with their legitimate families and others of whom continue to live with parents who raised them. Heartrending stories abound about the stolen children. Victoria Montenegro discovered that the man she worshipped and once considered her father and grandfather, she has 3 children of her own, a lieutenant colonel, had actually murdered her parents and stolen her. Journalist Roger Cohen of the New York Times told another depressing story. In 1987, he identified twin boys living with an Argentine couple in Paraguay. Cohen's investigation and genetic testing confirmed that the couple were not the birth parents of the boys. Paraguay extradited the couple to Argentina, and the man was convicted of kidnapping and sent to jail in 1995. Revisiting the story in 2008, Cohen found that his good deed had not led to joy. Mistakes had been made in identifying the birth parents. The boys, now 30, had been left confused and unhappy by the process. As Cohen noted, quote, "The justice I had helped deliver had consisted for them of one broken home after another." Cohen asked himself whether the truth he had delivered to the twins was worth it. He answered, "For the dead in Argentina, I say yes. For the twins, I don't know." Noting that some stories are, quote unquote, your actual responsibility, Cohen returned to Buenos Aires in 2014 and met with one of the twins, Gonzalo, who with his brother Matias had recently testified in a trial of former Army officers. He found Gonzalo still traumatized. His birth father's left hand had been found in a pile of bones outside the city of La Plata. Still, Gonzalo could not complete the grieving process and accept that he was an orphan. Joy did, however, accompany other family reunions. In 2014, Ignacio Herban, an accomplished pianist and composer, decided to give a sample of his DNA to the national database established by the grandmothers. Herban had been raised by a couple who farmed. As an infant, he had been given to the couple by an influential landowner who had ties to the Argentine military. The DNA test revealed that Herban was the grandson of Estela de Carlotto, the president of the grandmothers and a widely known symbol of the struggle for justice. Herban's birth mother, Laura Carlotto, was killed with a shot to the head shortly after giving birth in a military hospital in August 1978. She had been allowed to hold the baby, who she named Guido, for only 5 hours. The DNA match and the subsequent reunion of Estela with her grandson created a sense of euphoria throughout Argentina. At a news conference in early August 1914, Estela de Carlotto, who was 83 years old, announced, quote, "This great joy that life has brought me." But she also emphasized that, quote, "Now we need to keep looking for the rest of the missing." Chile's movement from impunity to justice followed a path similar to Argentina's. The ruthless General Pinochet dominated political life in Chile until 1998. Under mounting domestic and international pressure, Pinochet had agreed to hold a plebiscite in 1988, giving Chileans a choice on whether they want a continuation of one-man rule. Chile's left and political center parties united in a political alliance and urged Chileans to vote no. The no vote triumphed by a decisive 55-43. Pinochet agreed to relinquish the presidency, but he maintained substantial control. In 1978, he had declared a general amnesty for uniformed personnel. His constitution granted him the power to stay as commander-in-chief of the armed forces until 1998. In 1990, the glowering Pinochet draped the presidential sash over Patricio Aylwin of the Christian Democrats. President Aylwin and his successor moved cautiously on human rights issues. The new president appointed a National Commission on Truth and Reconciliation. The commission lacked subpoena power. It was authorized only to investigate the deaths at the hands of state agents. It could not name perpetrators of crimes, and it could not investigate cases of arbitrary detention or people who have been tortured but not murdered. Despite the restraints, the Commission provided a notable service to Chileans with its 1991 report. It documented over 2,000 deaths and disappearances. Subsequent investigations raised the death toll to over 3,000. The Commission rejected the Pinochet fantasy that the country had been at war after the overthrow of Salvador Allende and demonstrated that most of the dead were unarmed civilians, not armed guerrillas. General Pinochet denounced the Truth Commission as a sewer and boasted that the armed forces took pride in saving the country from terrorism and international communism. The only prominent Chilean political officer prosecuted was Manuel Contreras of Dina, who had overseen Operation Condor and the assassination of Orlando Letelier and Ronnie Moffett in Washington in 1976. Contreras received, however, only a light sentence for his crime. After 1998, Chileans began to engage directly with the past. General Pinochet stepped down as military commander 25 years after he seized power and took a seat in the legislature as a senator for life. As a senator, he would also preserve his impunity. In September 1998, the cocky general traveled to London for a back operation. While there, he had tea with his friend and fellow conservative, Lady Margaret Thatcher. He also went shopping in Harrods. Spain's Judge Baltasar Garzón seized the moment. Armed with the extradition treaty that existed between Spain and the United Kingdom, Garzón issued a warrant for Pinochet's arrest. On 16 October 1998, British authorities arrested Pinochet, and he was kept under house arrest for the next 16 months as the Spanish, British, and Chileans wrangled over the legal and jurisdictional issues. The British Foreign Office eventually shipped Pinochet home, ruling that he lacked the mental capacities to stand trial. Pinochet feigned illness, including dementia. But the once terrorized Chileans realize now that their emperor no longer wore clothes. After 2000, Pinochet would constantly find himself barraged with criminal cases and would lose his legal immunity and his senatorial seat. Chileans' fury mounted when they learned that Pinochet and his henchmen had stashed cash in banks around the world. Pinochet's secret bank accounts amounted to $28 million. Claiming their client's ill health, lawyers kept Pinochet out of a Chilean jail. The dictator died in 2006 at the age of 91. Pinochet's military colleagues were not as fortunate. A Chilean judge successfully argued that the amnesty law did not exempt from prosecution those who had disappeared Chileans. Because under a writ of habeas corpus, or do you have the body, the lack of a body meant that the kidnapping was an ongoing crime. Latin Americans' military dictatorships and death squads had thought that they were clever when they disappeared victims or disfigured bodies beyond recognition. By the end of 2006, more than 100 Chileans, including numerous generals, had been convicted of disappearing Chileans. Manuel Contreras of Operation Condor received a life sentence in 2008 for the assassination of General Carlos Prats and his wife in Buenos Aires. In late 2012, a Chilean judge charged 8 retired military officers for the murder of folk singer Victor Jara. And in mid-2014, a judge ruled that U.S. military intelligence service officers in Chile had aided and abetted the Chilean military in capturing 2 U.S. citizens living in Chile, Charles Horman, a journalist and filmmaker, and Frank Tarugi, an anti-war activist. The Chilean military murdered the 2 men in the National Stadium shortly after the golpe of 11 September 1973. Horman and Tarugi were the subjects of the award-winning film Missing of 1982, directed by Costa Gavras and starring Jack Lemmon and Sissy Spacek. Beyond prosecuting its criminals, Chile took a variety of other measures to come to terms with its ghastly past. President Ricardo Lagos Escobar appointed a new commission known as the Vallet Commission to listen to those who had been tortured. Over 36,000 Chileans came forward to provide evidence of torture. The commission also identified over 1,000 detention and torture centers. The most notorious torture center, Villa Grimaldi, was transformed into a memorial for Pinochet's victims. President Bachelet had been tortured at Villa Grimaldi. Chileans also renamed another place of torture, the National Stadium, the Estadio Victor Jara, after the murdered folk singer. And Chile erected a statue of Salvador Allende near the presidential palace, La Moneda. The statue carries the inscription of Allende's last public statement, quote, I have faith in Chile and her destiny. President Allende might think that faith was justified if he knew that his daughter Isabel Allende Bussi served as president of Chile's Chamber of Deputies. The Truth Commissions in Argentina, Chile, and El Salvador documented atrocities and assigned responsibility for the carnage to the anti-communist agents of the state. Analysts have noted, however, that these commissions avoided an extensive discussion of the political and social context in which the violence took place. The multi-volume study, Guatemala, Memory of Silence, compiled by the Guatemalan Commission for Historical Clarification in 1999, broke from that circumspect approach. International pressure had brought an end to the country's civil war in 1996. The UN designed the structure and composition of the Guatemalan Commission. The Commission held state security forces responsible for over 90% of Guatemala's more than 200,000 deaths. Agents of the state had targeted people because they were union leaders, rural organizers, and student activists who protested repression in Guatemala and wanted freedom and social justice. The military regimes also perpetrated racist genocidal policies against the Mayan. The United States bore responsibility for the violence that swept over Guatemala for 4 decades, according to the Commission. As the report noted, after the overthrow of President Arbenz in 1954, quote, there was a rapid reduction in the opportunity for political expression. A fundamentalist anti-communism therefore inspired legislation that consolidated the restrictive and exclusionary nature of the political system. The Cold War policies of the United States received an enthusiastic welcome from elites and right-wing political groups in Guatemala. The United States backed military regimes and directed its military assistance, quote, towards reinforcing the national intelligence apparatus and for training the officer corps in counterinsurgency techniques, key factors which had significant bearing on human rights violations during the armed confrontation. Indeed, the United States, according to the report, had fostered quote-unquote criminal counterinsurgency with its anti-Soviet strategy in Latin America. Guatemala has not initiated a campaign to identify and prosecute its murderers and terrorists, although in 2012 a Guatemalan court issued a life sentence to a soldier for his role in the massacre of 201 Mayan in the village of Dos Aires in 1982. The convicted soldier's commander-in-chief, General Rios Montt, is still not in jail for overseeing the destruction of Mayan communities. But the former president and general no longer breathes with impunity. In 1999, Rigoberta Menchú, Guatemalan human rights activist and indigenous leader who received the Nobel Prize for Peace, filed charges of genocide against Rio Montt in a Spanish court. Guatemala refused, however, to extradite the former president. Facing both international and domestic pressure, Guatemala finally put the old dictator on trial in 2013. The testimony was horrifying, with one man recounting how the military killed his wife and 2 children, slashing his young son's face with a machete and smashing his toddler's head. A Guatemalan tribunal on 10 May 2013 found Rios Montt guilty of genocide and crimes against humanity and sentenced him to 80 years in prison. But within 2 weeks, Guatemala's constitutional court overturned the conviction on a technicality. The nation's conservative oligarchy and business elite had vehemently opposed the trial. Rios Montt may be retried in the future. Other Latin American countries have not fully confronted their Cold War past. Uruguay's Truth Commission documented 164 disappearances between 1973 and 84 during the military dictatorship. But responding to political and military pressure, the Commission declined to say that the practice of disappearing people was official policy. In the 1980s, Uruguayans approved, both legislatively and via plebiscite, amnesties for the military and leftist guerrillas. The amnesty applied only to crimes committed in Uruguay. Uruguayan authorities have prosecuted officers who participated in Operation Condor, such as General Gregorio Alvarez, Uruguay's last dictator, who received a 25-year sentence. In 2011, dictator Juan Maria Bordaberry died under house arrest, having previously received a 30-year sentence for human rights crimes. Despite the prosecutions, Uruguayans remain deeply conflicted about the Cold War past. In 1994, they transformed the Punta Carretas prison that housed political dissidents into a stylish shopping mall, and I'll show you a photo of that a little bit later. But in 2007, they opened a Museo de la Memoria that details the years of state terrorism in Uruguay. The voting habits of Uruguayans also revealed ambivalence. In October 2009, Uruguay Supreme Court declared the amnesty law for the military unconstitutional in reference to a specific case. But a week later, in a national election, voters again declined to overrule the amnesty laws via constitutional amendment. In the same election, the leading vote-getter for the presidency was Jose Mujica of the leftist Broad Front Coalition. Now aged and plump, Mujica, a founder of an armed guerrilla movement, spent 14 years in military prison, often in subhuman conditions. President Mujica proved no radical in office, earning world renown for his unassuming ways, casual attire, and frugal lifestyle. He earned the nickname of the world's poorest president. In December 2014, Mujica fulfilled the promise he had made to President Barack Obama, accepting the transfer of 6 Guantanamo Bay detainees. The Uruguayan leader said his country would welcome, quote-unquote, human beings that have endured an atrocious kidnapping. South America's most influential nation, Brazil, took until December 2014, a mere 2 months ago, to assess the era of military dictatorship. The military amnesty law of 1979 has not been repealed or declared unconstitutional by Brazilian courts, and authorities did not investigate deaths, disappearances, or torture. Brazil has shown remarkable economic growth in the 21st century, and Brazil has become a leading voice in global economic affairs, especially under the leadership of the working-class hero, President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, popularly known as Lula. President Lula disappointed Brazil's human rights community by not establishing a Truth Commission. The able Brazilian leader was aware of the past. The president's chief of staff was Dilma Rousseff. In 2010, Brazilians elected Rousseff to the presidency of Brazil. In 2012, President Rousseff established a Truth Commission to investigate human rights abuses perpetrated by military dictators. The 2,000-page report submitted by Brazil's National Truth Commission about 6 weeks ago proved a remarkable document. The 7-member commission lacks subpoena power, and military authorities refused to cooperate. Nonetheless, the commission documented 434 killings or disappearances and the widespread use of torture and arbitrary detentions during the period from 1964 to 85. Brazilian security agents crucified torture victims, beating the palms of their hands with sticks as they hung on the walls of interrogation centers. The commission focused on those cases it could document, reasoning that many other murders and gross violations of human rights had occurred. It assigned responsibility to human rights abuses to military rulers, noting, quote, under the military dictatorship, repression and the elimination of political opposition became the policy of the state. The commission added, however, that more than 300 members of the Brazilian military studied at the School of Americas at Fort Benning in Georgia, where they had theoretical and practical lessons in torture, which would later be replicated in Brazil. Unlike the recently released U.S. Senate Intelligence Committee report on torture, the Brazilian report identified those who murdered and tortured, some 377 names are listed, and called for the criminal prosecution of those still living, about 100, and the repeal of the 1979 amnesty law. The normally steely President Rousseff was overcome by emotion when she presented the report. She fought back tears, halting in mid-sentence when she said, quote, and most of all, those who deserve the truth are those who lost family members, friends, companions, and continue to suffer as if they had died again each and every day. Now, to the U.S. Scattered apologies, not truth commissions, have served as the official U.S. response to the Cold War in Latin America. In 1999, during a visit to Guatemala after the release of Memory of Silence, President Bill Clinton observed that, quote, it was imperative that he address the report. In frank language, Clinton said, for the United States, it's important that I state clearly that support for military forces of intelligence units which engage in violent and widespread repression of the kind described in the report was wrong, and the United States must not repeat that mistake. Secretary of State Colin Powell also suggested there were Cold War activities that did not bring credit to the United States. In 2003, Secretary Powell addressed the U.S. role in the overthrow of Salvador Allende, noting, quote, it's not part of American history that we are proud of. Sporadic expressions of regret about the U.S. role in Latin America in the Cold War did not inspire demands for investigations and accountability. Only the continuing presence of Henry Kissinger, Richard Nixon's sidekick, caused some to think about U.S. actions in Latin America. Kissinger enjoys a position as a sage and thoughtful commentator on international affairs, who was consulted by journalists and asked to appear on high-tone public affairs TV programs. But the iconoclastic public intellectual, the late Christopher Hitchens, called for Kissinger to face war crimes trials for his decisions and policies, including his involvement in the assassination of General René Schneider of Chile. Kissinger also faced calls from international jurists in Argentina and Chile to testify about his involvement with Operation Condor in the overthrow of Salvador Allende. Kissinger, through his lawyers, issued the vague response that he wished, quote, to contribute what he can from his memory of those distant events. Kissinger has also faced a little trouble abroad. In 2001, a French judge sent police officers to Kissinger's hotel in Paris to serve him with a request to answer questions about the U.S. involvement in the Chilean golpe. Kissinger refused to respond to the subpoena, referred the matter to the Department of State, and flew on to Italy. One U.S. casualty of the Cold War in Latin America was the infamous School of Americas. By 2000, the school had trained over 60,000 members of the Latin American military. 75% of the military officers cited for involvement in major massacres in El Salvador had trained at the School of Americas. Other criminals who had studied at the school included Generals Galtieri of Argentina and Rios Montt of Guatemala. In the 1990s, Representative Joseph Kennedy, the nephew of President John Kennedy, led the movement to close the School of the Americas. Representative Kennedy pressured the U.S. military to declassify training manuals used at the school. The manuals referred to tactics of false imprisonment, abuse of prisoners, torture, and the quote-unquote neutralization or assassination of suspects. Kennedy and his successors annually attempted to cut off funds for the school, finally succeeding in 1999. The Clinton administration closed the School of the Americas in 2000, but reopened it in 2001 as the Western Hemisphere Institute for Security Cooperation. The United States has given haphazard assistance to the hunt for murderers and torturers who have fled their countries. In 2007, the human rights community hailed the arrest and subsequent extradition to Argentina of Major Ernesto Guillermo Barrero. Barrero was the chief interrogator at the La Perla detention center in Cordoba. The U.S. Justice Department during the Obama administration has been somewhat more forthcoming on human rights issues, extraditing alleged criminals to El Salvador and Guatemala. In August 2013, a court in Boston sentenced General Inocente Orlando Montaño to 21 months in prison for immigration violations. Colonel Montaño had hid in the United States for 10 years, was named in the UN Truth Commission report as a participant in the plot that killed 6 Jesuit priests at the University of Central America in San Salvador in 1989. In April 2014, a judge in Miami ordered the deportation of General Jose Guillermo Garcia to El Salvador. The judge ruled that he found, quote-unquote, clear and convincing evidence that General Garcia, who had served as El Salvador's defense minister, played a role in numerous violent incidents, including the murder of 3 U.S. nuns and a lay worker in late 1980. In the public realm, debates over the issues of access to the documentary record have been the U.S. equivalent of a truth commission. Scholars have made progress in opening up the official record. The Clinton administration proved especially amenable to opening the record, authorizing major declassifications of records on U.S. policies toward El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. In 1999, the administration, in response to the mounting international furor over General Pinochet, produced the Chile Declassification Project. The project yielded over 20,000 documents on U.S. policies towards Chile from 1973 to 1990. The CIA has been recalcitrant in releasing documents, but in 2007 it disclosed the quote-unquote family jewels documents on top-secret operations, including the CIA's collaboration with the mafia in plots to kill Fidel Castro. In 2009, the Historical Office issued in electronic form a volume on U.S. relations with Latin America during the first administration of Richard Nixon. The electronic volume generated international publicity because it demonstrated that President Nixon had asked Brazil's military government to enlist in the war against Salvador Allende. U.S. and Latin American citizens have not, however, gained complete access to the documentary record. The new electronic volume on Latin America did not offer documents on the Nixon administration's attitude toward military governments in Bolivia and Uruguay. In 2011, Republicans in the House of Representatives blocked a move by Democrats to release U.S. intelligence files on the Argentine military dictatorship. In mid-2014, however, Vice President Joseph Biden personally delivered to President Rousseff 43 State Department documents that reported on torture techniques used by Brazilian security forces. Finally, let me note that the lack of historical consciousness about the U.S. role in Latin America during the Cold War took on ironic tones in 2014. Tens of thousands of mothers and children from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras turned themselves into U.S. immigration authorities at the Texas-Mexican border. Some of the children were as young as 8 years of age and had made the arduous trek from Central America through Mexico on their own. U.S. political pundits emphasized that the Central American children fled poverty and violence fueled by gangs and narco-traffickers. Indeed, gangs like MS-13 and M-18 terrorized Salvadorans and Guatemalans. Many gang leaders had learned their nefarious trade in the United States. Young men migrated to the United States during the Cold War, associated with gangs in U.S. cities like Los Angeles, developed criminal records, and were subsequently deported back to their home countries. But such Central American gangs flourished in a culture of violence that the United States had helped create during the Cold War by bolstering military dictatorships and their associated death squads. Discourse among politicians and pundits rarely, however, placed the migration crisis within an historical context. So, I end here because there really isn't an end. I mean, as you might have noted here, I was talking about things 2013, 2014. This is an ongoing process in Latin America. Whether such a process will continue in the United States, I think is mainly a sort of scholarly process. So now what I'd like to do, kind of supplement, is show you to put some flesh and blood on some of the people and institutions that I've just been speaking about. And if you press, and then put right here. Okay. There's 27 of them here, and I'll just do a little riff on each one. This is one of the photos that prompted me to do the book, The Killing Zone. This photo appeared in 2007 in the New York Times. It was the front page story. This is Suzanne Marie Berghaus. Suzanne Marie Berghaus is speaking to her mother and father, who are on the right side of the picture, except she's not speaking to them. She is, she needs a translator, the lady who's got her hand on her shoulder. The reason is Suzanne was kidnapped at the age of 18. At the age of 18 months by the Salvadoran military. The Salvadoran military kidnapped little children for two reasons: to sell them to orphanages and also to terrorize the campesinos. As it turns out, Suzanne is not alone, and so she had been matched up with DNA. There is an association in the United States as well as in Salvador that has discovered that somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 children were adopted in the United States whose birth parents were still alive. They had simply been kidnapped. Since I wrote The Killing Zone, I've had letters from both professors as well as students who said, I'm adopted. I'm Guatemalan and I'm adopted. I'm not so sure now. I'm not so sure. The next one. This is a picture of the famous Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo. I will tell you, if these women are not the bravest women in the world, they are certainly the most persistent. They march every Thursday, 3:30, doesn't matter whether it's holiday, they march every Thursday at 3:30 in the Central Plaza near the Casa Rosada, the presidential palace. They have been marching since 1977. Now they march now more triumphant because they have made great progress in the last 10 years. They started marching in 1977 asking where are our children who have been disappeared. Subsequently, of course, they marched to where are our grandchildren who may have been born in prison. When they arrive, they're very elderly now, 70s, 80s, and 90s. When they arrive around 3:15, they come in a kind of senior citizens bus. We identify as senior citizens. And when they arrive, there's a big cheer. And then they march in a circle for 10, 15 minutes. They say nothing. Because in 1977, 78, 79, they were not allowed to speak. They used to wear stitched to their clothing photographs of their missing children. Go to the next one. As you can see, and they're then joined by groups. This particular day, a lot of university students joined marching behind them. Next one. Good. And as you can see, they're very, very elderly. They have been, this is now some 37, 38 years. They've been marching every Thursday at 3:30. And at the beginning, this was a very dangerous thing to do. Captain Astiz infiltrated the group, identified some of them, and of course 13 were murdered in 1977, 78. This is their international symbol, the white kerchief. This is a Stella de Carlato.
She's the president of the grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo. This was a couple of years ago. And she's holding a picture of her daughter, Laura, who was murdered by the military. Estela de Carlotto had some connections, and so, unlike most, the body of Laura, after she'd been murdered, was delivered back to her. Laura had been shot in the head, but they also noticed that bullets had been pumped into her stomach. So she contracted the services of a U.S. forensic anthropologist, and they determined that Laura had given birth. Subsequently, when she was able to find out more, she learned that Laura, just before her death, said to her murderers, "My mother will find you out." And indeed she did. This is at the School of Economics at the University of Buenos Aires. Each floor you go up has photos of students who were murdered by the Argentine military. Note here that there were some 70 students and graduates of the School of Economics at the University of Buenos Aires. So as you mount the stairs on each floor, there are these photos. This again is Estela de Carlotto at the age of 83, 84. In Argentina, she is incredibly famous. If you just go on YouTube, you can watch documentaries on her if you understand Spanish. There have been documentaries made about her in other parts of the world. And of course, as I understand, next week you're going to see a film about the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo and the search for disappeared children. This is her grandson, Guido, who went to the DNA bank, began to have doubts, and it was a match. And as you could see, that's her grandson. Just look at the teeth. Look at the facial teeth. That's her grandson. This set off in Argentina in August and September of this year enormous euphoria. That a person who had crusaded so hard to find other people's children and grandchildren had finally found her own grandson. The Argentines have this wonderful term for those who raise the kidnapped children. They call them the appropriators. The appropriators. Now I should point out, here's a general picture. Hold on for a second. Here's a general picture of Cristina Kirchner, the president of Argentina. This was before Estela had found her own grandson, but some of the grandmothers and some of the children that have been found. There's about 114 that have been found now out of about the estimated 500. If you are an Argentine person in your sort of mid-30s now, early 30s, and you are adopted, you can go to the DNA bank. Now, there's no doubt that a lot of children just don't want to know. There actually have been some cases in Argentina where the court has ordered children to give DNA and they have refused, and they have fought it in court, because it is just such a wrenching process to learn that maybe the first 30 years of your life have been a fraud. So this is an enormous case. And of course, it's the same here with the 1,500 to 2,000 children in the United States whose birth parents are alive. And then, of course, there are large numbers of Guatemalan children who also experienced this. Next week. Now, this is the famous Escuela de Mecánica de la Armada, the Navy Mechanical School. Okay. This is on the 8100 block of Liberator Avenue in Buenos Aires. Buenos Aires is designed like Paris with the great boulevards. Liberator Avenue is like 12 lanes. This is in a neighborhood. It's about 4 miles out from the center of the city, but it's in a big neighborhood. Okay. It's a campus, a military campus. 5,000 people entered that door. 150 emerged alive. Over 4,800 people were murdered in this complex. There are apartment buildings right over. If you go to the next one. This is the exact building here. I don't have photos that I can show you inside because it's still an ongoing crime scene. And this is the officers' club and residence. And so officers are living on the first, second, and third floors. In the basement, people were being tortured and murdered. The normal process would be that they were kidnapped by security forces in civilian clothes, usually driving in Ford Falcons. A hood would be placed over their head. And the protocol was within 30 minutes of arriving, you would be tortured. And it was basically kind of a pyramid scheme. Give us some names so we can go out and capture some more people. After a week or two of torture, people would be given a sedative, they'd be drugged, they'd be placed on a helicopter or plane, and their body would just be done. So they were alive, and they'd be just thrown out of helicopters and airplanes into Rio de la Plata, into the South Atlantic Ocean. They'd come around the back so that you couldn't see right from the main street. And the Ford Falcons would come. There are a handful of photos showing this. Now the whole campus is a national kind of museum and memory center, but they also have ongoing studies here. And here is the where people are trained in forensic science. And Argentines, for example, I noticed a student had a book on the massacre at El Mozote. It was Argentine scientists who exhumed the bodies of the 800 bodies at El Mozote and helped people identify them. So the Argentines have developed this sort of expertise, and it's fostered here at this campus. My favorite place. Punta Carretas. Note the word, shopping. There are good words in Spanish for shopping, but this is shopping. This is a prison with the McCafe and the Sheraton in the background. In the back is the prison. It was a notorious prison. President Mujica stayed there. It was a notorious prison. So what did the Uruguayans do? To expunge the past, they turned to global consumerism. They turned it into a shopping center. So my wife and I went there to take photos. We were in Montevideo this summer. So we were looking around. There must be a plaque here that says this was once a prison. No, we couldn't find the plaque. So eventually a security person came up to us and tapped us on the shoulder and have photos. Shopping. Who's shopping? You're saying that's from looking outwards. You can get your chicken McBites at McDonald's, etc. And even on the main highway, there's a big sign that says shopping. And there's points that way. On the other hand, here's the Museo de la Memoria, which is really, it's an outstanding museum comparable to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. It's really quite an outstanding museum and very candid, noting both the national and international aspects of the terror in Uruguay. And I just took a picture. They have a variety of pictures of disappeared people. As you can see, she looks quite subversive and dangerous. This is one of the last, this is the trial of General Bignone. I pick it because they look like a bunch of mafia figures, of which basically what they were. General Bignone is kind of forward here, and the figure where the focus is on the light. He was the last dictator of Argentina. He was given a 25-year sentence in the age of 80s, and he's subsequently convicted for other crimes and given another 25, 30 years in prison. Yes. Henry Kissinger and General Pinochet. Now, if you read Henry Kissinger's memoirs, he said when he met with General Pinochet in June of 1976 in Santiago, just prior to an OAS meeting, that he gave him a tough lecture on human rights. However, when President Clinton declassified the 20,000 documents, people at the National Security Archive dug into it and found quite the opposite, that Kissinger said to him, well, I'm going to give a tough speech tomorrow at the OAS, which he did, a defense of human rights, and in so many words he said, just ignore the speech. Just ignore the speech. I should also note that it was at this meeting that he met with the foreign minister of Argentina and told the foreign minister of Argentina, do what you have to do. And which he, in general terms, described what the Argentine military was going to do, and he said, do what you have to do. Here is Ronald Reagan rubbing elbows with General Rios Montt of Guatemala. They met in Honduras. Reagan therefore went out in front of the cameras and said that General Rios Montt was a misunderstood guy. That he was a strong anti-communist, but that he respected human rights. The fact of the matter is General Rios Montt was convicted of genocide. That during his 1 year in office, at least 40,000 people were murdered, mostly Mayan people. Back in Buenos Aires. He is everywhere, Pope Francis. He's number 2 in Argentina. Lionel Messi, the football star, he's number 1. Eva Perón's been pushed to number 3. Wherever you go, there are images of Pope Francis. He is everywhere. He is everywhere. And here, Diogenes, if we had a present-day Diogenes looking for an honest man, here are 2 honest men. The Pope, and this is Jose Mujica, the president of Uruguay. He retires in March as president of Uruguay. Mujica never wears a tie. He sometimes wears a belt. He sometimes wears shoes. Usually he likes sandals better. And sometimes he wears socks. He is incredibly popular in Uruguay. His presidential limousine is a VW Beetle, driven by his friend. They drive around Uruguay in the VW Beetle. He has lunch every day with his chauffeur. He's totally unpretentious. And he's pushed Uruguay in a very interesting way. He's very libertarian on social issues. So in terms of gay marriage and other such issues, Uruguay has passed a variety of laws legalizing gay marriage, smoking marijuana, even though Mujica is kind of against smoking in general. On the other hand, he's quite neoliberal in economic policies, and Uruguay has become a greater exporter of beef and wheat than Argentina. He's extremely popular, and he's being succeeded by the previous president, who's even as popular. But the man who will take office is an oncologist, and when he takes office, he'll still maintain office hours for like 2 days a week in terms of treating cancer patients. Here's the Pope with Estela de Carlotto and her grandson Guido. The Pope keeps very, very close eyes on all of these things about the prosecution of war criminals and the hunt for the disappeared, etc. I put this one up because this is Estela de Carlotto, the leader of the grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo, and there's a garden being set up in Paris. There's enormous, if you go on YouTube, you will find that there are documentaries made about this group in Australia, in the United Kingdom, wherever, as well as in other Spanish-speaking countries. You'd be hard-pressed to find many U.S. citizens who know much about the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo. A good picture. Showed you some grim ones, but here's a good one. The presidents of Argentina, Brazil, and Chile. Latin America has that reputation of being the land of macho, but there's been a woman president of Costa Rica, a woman president of Panama, and ABC countries, Argentina, Brazil, and Chile, are led by women. Now, two of them, to the right is Dilma Rousseff. I would say, I'm not obviously clinically experienced, I think that she really has PTSD. I mean, she has lots of difficulty dealing with what happened to her as a young person. I do not know this for a fact, but generally speaking, when women were tortured, they were also gang raped. President Bachelet was clearly abused. Her mother was abused. Her father died under torture. Christina Kirchner to the left, always stylish as an Argentine, she and her husband pretty much just kind of retreated from politics during La Guerra Sucia. But I think it's a kind of uplifting photo, and it's a whole lot better looking than the next one to look at. The next one, please. Let's go back to the ladies. You go to the other side. Go back to the ladies. Hit the other spot. There you go. There you go. So that's pretty much where I concluded. I guess now I'm supposed to be interrogated myself. Hopefully not.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for a very enlightening and at the same time quite shocking talk. What we would like to do now is have a little panel discussion
no pun intended in the
with
shocking,
Lars Schoultz and myself, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. Thanks very much. Let's do that. Thank you again for a very enlightening talk, and we would like to ask you a few questions. Professor Lars Schoultz here of UMC will ask the tough questions. I just want to ask a very general question. You are a Cold War historian and international historian. What made you particularly interested in Latin America and the many countries of Latin America?
Well, I suspect there was a fairly just pragmatic reason of, I was studying U.S. foreign relations, why study inter-American relations. I suspect there was a pragmatic reason that I had studied Spanish beginning in high school, continued studying Spanish in college, so access to the language was probably pretty important. I'd say, however, it's been reinforced by my experience in Latin America. I often tell my students that if I could be reincarnated, I'd come back as a Latin American. I love living in Latin America. I love being in Latin America. I love the Latin American respect for history, for tradition and culture. I love the Latin American respect for family. Now, I certainly wouldn't want to come back as a poor Latin American, and I'm not over romantic about life in Latin America. Life for poor people in Latin America is very hard. But if you have a little bit of material well-being, if you're a middle-class person in Latin America, I just think that Latin Americans overall are just happier people and live fuller lives than many citizens in the United States, and mainly because they pay attention to the important things, which are family and friends.
Thanks very much. Would you pass it on to us?
I don't like that word interrogate. I am here because I called Klaus up and I said, Klaus, I see that Steve Rabe is coming to Chapel Hill. Would you mind sharing him with me and letting me have lunch or coffee or something? And he said, no, why don't we do what we're doing right now? And I'm happy to do that because I've known several of Steve's students over the years. And of course I've read all his work. You can't work in this field without reading it. And his work has a charm to it, even when it's addressing subjects like this, that it's very hard to communicate unless you sit down with a cup of coffee and just read a couple of chapters, and you'll see what I mean immediately. But I was going through this book. This is the Killing Zone, the most recent, published, I don't know why, by Oxford University Press instead of UNC. I was reading at the book, and there was some reference to a study that I hadn't seen before, so I turned back to the bibliography, and this will give you an interesting measure of the man. Right at the beginning of the bibliography is a little paragraph that reads as follows. If you are interested in pursuing any of the topics or issues raised in my study, you can contact me, either writing or sending me an email inquiry. I have been offering bibliographic advice to colleagues, students, and citizens for over 30 years now. I do not consider it an imposition. It's my job. I had never seen anything like that before. Florence Babb, if you ever put that in one of your bibliography? Not yet. Before I met Steve, I found that we populate the same libraries. I was frankly a little annoyed with you at first, but I've overcome that. I went to the Eisenhower Library in Abilene, Kansas. I told these presidential libraries, they assign an archivist. You tell them what you're interested in, and an archivist is assigned to you and will help you find the relevant documents. So I sat down with the archivist for the Eisenhower's Latin American materials, and I went through what I was what I was hoping to find in the documents in the library. And the archivist looked up and she said, you know, Steve Rabe has already done all this. Great. I mean, you know how hard it is to get to Abilene, Kansas, just to get there. About maybe 3 or 4 years later, I went to the Kennedy Library in Boston, Massachusetts, and the same thing happened. The same conversation occurred, and he said, you know, have you ever talked with Steve Rabe? The idea was that why do you bother doing this primary research when you've got this book published by UNC Press on the Eisenhower administration, you got another book published by UNC Press on the Kennedy administration, why don't you just go ahead and
read the book?
I had read the book, I was just looking for my own. And in any event, I have absolutely no interest whatever in interrogation, but I'm interested in getting him here in front of me because there's some questions I have that are more related to his work. First, I'd like to ask your perception of how a society gets over the moral disasters that he's been talking about. How does a society manage to do that? And in particular, I'd like to address this question of truth commissions. It's not an aged concept. It's relatively new, as I understand it. And I'd like to know whether you think it's been satisfactory in the sense of easing people's pain. There's no way that you can get over the fact that these people were killed and tortured.
Steve, this is a question that I really can't answer because I don't have the training in terms of the psychology of people who have been traumatized in this particular way. I mean, generally, I think our common sense thing is that you have to talk things out if you have deep traumas.
What I do know is that, I'm speaking about things that took place in the 1970s and 80s, but are now only being investigated in the first 15 years of the 21st century and discussed and talked about. One of the things I've learned, one of the great historians of this era is Steve Stern, an historian of Chile. He's a great historian of Latin America in general, but Chile, and he makes the point that it often takes 20 to 25 years for people who have been tortured to even discuss it, that is almost a passing of time. I don't think, for example, I think if we were to ask this question of President Rousseff, she would probably say, yes, we need to know the truth. But even though she broke down, I mean, she's a very steely person, and she broke down presenting the report. So and we have these other accounts by a woman who was tortured by the Chilean military and then cooperated with the Chilean military, and then it's just had this horrible kind of trying to come to grips with both experiences. I'm not sure. I mean, Roger Cohen was deeply conflicted about what he did, and he remains deeply conflicted about finding out this Argentine couple living in Paraguay that they had stolen these two boys. It's an outstanding question. As an historian, basically all I can say is that I'm just trying to reveal what happened and to tell to the best of my ability what happened. And of course, I'm trying to raise the issue with U.S. citizens that things happened here in your name, and it's not enough to say that Lech Walesa and Mikhail Gorbachev and Angela Merkel can walk triumphantly through where the Berlin Wall was and say everything is fine and everything is good. It seems to me to place a very low value on the lives of Latin Americans. And that's another thing that troubles me about all of this. As I was mentioning earlier discussion, I don't know how many times people at scholarly conferences, my colleagues have approached me and said, "Hi Steve, are you still working on Latin America?" As if why does an intelligent person like you place your emphasis on something more important? You asked a wonderful question, and I really can't say, and I don't think anybody who has investigated this can say, other than as a historian, you're supposed to pursue where the facts take you.
Okay. Let me ask you a question about the policy-making process. In Steve's book on the Eisenhower administration, Eisenhower in Latin America is the title. He says, near the end, he says that the president, Eisenhower, has often been identified as a hands-off, not much interested in day-to-day decisions. But some of you with a little bit of gray hair will remember he played golf a lot and so forth. And Steve said, look, I've been through all the documents. I've found just the opposite. The president, and now I'm quoting a sentence, the president was decisive, energetic, and well-informed. Okay, and I'll concede that. I think that's probably the case. But that was when there was a focus to U.S. policy, the Cold War focus. And I wondered if you would talk about how it's possible for a president today, an Obama or a Bush, to get some future historian to write a sentence like that about him when these problems shift every few hours. The issues spring up in front of us, Yemen last week, that no president can be expected to handle. The Department of State, it seems to me, and we have a career Foreign Service officer in the front row, so I've got to be careful, but it seems to me the Department of State is just battered from pillar to post. Sure, there's depth and there's specialization, but the issues keep coming at leaders. And so in the process of foreign policy, how does a president, who is, of course, supposed to be in control, how does he control when he's overwhelmed?
I wouldn't speak so much about the contemporary period, but I would go back to Eisenhower. Anyone who studies Eisenhower, the idea that Eisenhower was a great general and a failed president, it wouldn't have made much sense. So that Eisenhower basically took his very elaborate staff system that he had developed in managing the invasion of Europe in 1944, and he brought it to the White House. So that I think that, and large numbers of scholars have noted that Eisenhower had a very elaborate system in terms of the National Security Council, in terms of the Operations Coordinating Board, in his meetings with John Foster Dulles, etc., that he designed in a very elaborate system so that he could stay on top of the policy process. And in fact, there are articles that say on top of the policy process. So it seems to me this rather very elaborate and bureaucratic staff system that he inherited from his military background that gave Eisenhower the ability to control the policy making. Now, that doesn't say the policy is good or bad, but rather that he was in charge. He was made fun of a lot by presidential candidates such as John Kennedy, who said, who didn't want such an elaborate system, wanted quicker and more decisive action as Kennedy saw it. But then, I think Kennedy, by the end of his life, had realized that his way of organizing things wasn't necessarily as good as they saw. For example, right near the end of his life, in early November, Kennedy made a tape by himself in which he confessed, I bear responsibility for the death of President Siem and the assassination of President Siem in South Vietnam. And I, without even thinking, passed over and signed off on a paper because I was at Hyannisport, I was vacationing, I signed on this paper, and this led to the overthrow of Siem. And Kennedy said, well, maybe we should have had a more elaborate procedure here in terms of discussing such an important issue. Whereas such a thing never would have happened in the Eisenhower administration because of the very significant elaborate process that he had put in. Which isn't to always say that Eisenhower made correct decisions or that he always controlled things. For example, he regretted the U-2 incident because he kept saying we shouldn't do this, this is going to blow up in our face, we shouldn't have these overflights over the Soviet Union, even though he actually went through a process and he did okay it. It seems to me that most historians feel that Eisenhower was quite different in terms of this kind of very elaborate policy procedure of how a policy is initiated, how it's debated, how it's implemented, putting up kind of three different ways of looking at it. First, the idea, the discussion of it, and then the implementation.
Thank you. But of course, the coup in Guatemala happened in 1954 when Eisenhower was president. Despite that staff system, some deliberate action was taken, I would assume. Let me also ask you about Kissinger and Reagan. You hinted at complicity, and I assume that both politicians were not interested per se in being on the side of murderers and torturers. So what drove them to, let's say, sympathize with Pinochet or with other dictatorships? Was it the belief in stability and order over human rights, or what was it what made the United States administrations sympathize with Latin American dictators?
That's a very complicated question. First, the point I want to make, we mentioned Reagan, we mentioned Nixon and Kissinger. I want to emphasize that my accusing finger is a bipartisan accusing finger, and if you look at other things I've done in terms of Kennedy and Johnson, I do not let the Democrats off. The only exception, of course, is President Carter, who does pursue a human rights policy, and there are identifiable Latin Americans who are alive today because of the efforts of the human rights policy of President Carter, of the efforts of the Assistant Secretary for Human Rights, Patricia Darien, for diplomats in Argentina, for example, such as Tex Harris, etc. So I want to make that one point. Now the question is, why did, through much of the Cold War, the United States, though ostensibly promoting democracy, side with dictators? In the end, it seems to me there are three or four things. One, because, as the person to my right has written in his textbook on U.S.-Latin American relations, too often Latin Americans are considered beneath the United States, literally and metaphorically. That there is an element of kind of patronizing, condescending attitude towards Latin Americans. Two, there is a sense that the United States is engaged in momentous events and that it needs its quote-unquote backyard to be stable. Once Secretary of State Dean Rusk once told the Argentine foreign minister that if he did not vote with the United States on Cuba, the Soviet Union might invade West Berlin.
I'm sure the Argentine foreign minister was confused by that argument, but that kind of sense of that the United States needed to maintain order and stability in its own hemisphere in order to confront the Soviet Union. There's also the sense that Latin America could become a political problem for a president. Cuba became a political problem for Richard Nixon in 1960. John Kennedy was determined to avoid that type of issue, just as China had become a problem for the Democrats in the late 1940s and early 1950s. And then there was always the concern that there could be something like a Cuban Missile Crisis that would pose a direct national security threat to the United States. But large numbers of historians have essentially said that U.S. policy is it's symbolic politics that the United States is engaged in Latin America, that we need to demonstrate that we are tough, that we're in charge of the situation, etc. And while someone once said about Secretary Dulles, he would have liked to see flourishing little democracies, but it wasn't in the nature of things. So security and stability has always been the watchword for the U.S. policies in Latin America since 1895.
Thank you very much. Last, just one final question.
Well, yes, but it'll be a quick one because I think we're abusing our audience to a certain extent. But let me ask you a little bit about your feeling of how you and your generation have produced history. Your Kennedy book the Kennedy era was an era of the grand theorizing about modernization and development, and it failed. And as Professor Rabe points out, he talks about the demonstrated shortcomings in theories of modernization and middle class revolution. That's true. Those are the people we studied to complete our education, and the study of them, I'm sure, was illuminating to a certain extent, but they were more or less dead wrong on just about everything in theoretical terms, the theories that they propounded. So let me ask you, Stephen Ray, to comment on what the next generation of historians is going to say about your generation's work.
Sure. First, the new generation of historians are improving and are doing much better than I did. What? First thing is that Latin American, in terms of writing about inter-American relations, Latin American nations, particularly as they pursue some of the criminals of the past, violators of human rights, have been opening up their national archives and opening up their records. One of the major criticisms that has been made in my work, particularly on some of the books, is that say, well, I don't have a good deal of Latin American sources. Well, part of it is because I was writing in a kind of contemporary period, contemporary meaning 60s, 70s, 80s, where I didn't have access to archival sources in Latin America. So there are some very new historians, such as Tanya Harmer at the London School of Economics, who's written this wonderful book about Chile as a global process, where she's gained access to Chilean archives, she's gained access to Eastern European archives. So I would say that the new work is going to be better than the old work because it's going to be more multi-archival and give more of a global perspective and give more of an international perspective. I don't feel guilty on that issue because simply the archives were not available to me at the time. One of my first books on Venezuela, then I had, which goes back into the early 20th century, then I had access to Venezuelan archives and Venezuelan documentary material. But the new work is just simply going to be better. And there are lots of really good young historians now working in the field of inter-American relations. Alan McPherson's book on the U.S. occupation of Nicaragua and Haiti in the Dominican Republic in the early 20th century has it really brings in a strong Latin American perspective. So the criticism of me will that I focused on U.S. policy making, and the new work will simply be better.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much. Let's open it to questions from the audience, and I'm sure there are quite a few. I'll get you immediately.
Thank you. I'm Roger Watson, Professor Emeritus in the History Department here, and I enjoyed your talk very much. And I'm quite prepared to believe everything that you said. I'm sure that I did all these terrible things, but nonetheless, I thought your talk was very one-sided. But was there a left wing in Latin America that ever did anything nasty? It was just generals doing all the bad stuff.
It's a good question. It's a fair question. It's a good and fair question. First, I want to point out to you that the truth commissions, which are international bodies, have documented that depending on the country, the right was responsible for 85 to 90 to 97% to 99% of the atrocities. I mean, these are documented statistics. Now, there is a school of thought that will say that something to the effect that the right reacted to the threat of the left, that there's, to use the quotation of one particular book, that it was a logical but exaggerated response of the threat to the left. There's nothing logical about anti-Semitism. In Argentina, disproportionately of the 30,000 people were Jewish people who were killed. So anti-Semitism, there's nothing logical or explainable about attacking disabled people who want rights for disabled people. In many ways, those who took over were imbibed in doctrines that essentially, to use Steve Stern's word, were involved in policide. They didn't think people should engage in politics, that people should not speak up for better living conditions, better working conditions. There's sometimes a sense to say, well, this is simply a response to Fidel Castro. One, it precedes Fidel Castro because of what happened in Guatemala. When you find, for example, in Guatemala, what happened in Guatemala, when Secretary Dulles and President Eisenhower, in their policy-making process, approved the overthrow of President Arbenz and the CIA operation, they were just simply shocked to find out that they went through the entire archives, and they kept saying, well, there's got to be evidence here. There's got to be ties with the international communist movement. And they couldn't find it. They couldn't find it.
Where do you put Perón in all this? He was quite an leftist.
Well, Perón is.
He's a leftist, rightist.
That would be good. That would be a good description. Yes. So, I mean, are there atrocities by the left? Yes. And if you read my book as opposed to listening to the paper here, you'll see that I dwell on some of the madness of the left, and I do cite such instances of the madness of the left, but by and large, I mean, there's the numbers of people killed by right and right-wing death squads are just so overwhelming, and often it hasn't anything to do with ideology of left and right. Is that simply you're in favor of land reform? The United States sponsored the overthrow of Jacobo Arbenz. As people said, 7 or 8 years later, President Kennedy would have embraced him as a land reformer. So you make a very, very good, you make an excellent point that there is, that the left is out there, but whether they precipitated any, and caused this and are responsible for this, I think is highly exaggerated. I mean, we have instances where children, in Brazil, leftist agitation occurred after the right wing took over. We have accounts where the Brazilian military marched into student campuses and killed students because they were protesting cafeteria food. Well, it's been the eternal right of students to complain about cafeteria food because it's not like mom's. It had nothing to do with ideology. Nothing to do with ideology. And much of the violence, as people will point out, that Salvador Allende and his Unidad Popular coalition was practicing peaceful parliamentary politics. They were being attacked by the right from 1970-73. There are a lot of deaths during Allende's 3 years in office. They're all committed by right-wing people. They were committed by Allende. It's simply a kind of fantasy that there was a rise of the right in Chile because of the threat of the left. He'd won a parliamentary election. This is a constitutional system. So,
thank you.
Thank you.
Yep.
I'm from Mississippi, which makes me a deep Southerner, which makes me aware that the atrocities of societies are often in themselves never acknowledged, not only in their time, but thereafter. So to this moment, hearing these terrible stories of Latin America, I'm reminded of the kinds of things that happened in my country, my part of the country, for decades and then for a century, without any Truth Commission and no willingness to accept responsibility. And everyone's saying, why do we still have to talk about that? Going into your examples, however, I just want to say that it is enraging, quite purely enraging, to hear your stories, because they are, in fact, if not organized by, tolerated for sure, winked at often, and explicitly understood in Latin America to be the extension of what we want in the region. None of which any governmental unit is willing to acknowledge at this moment. The individual sort of semi-apology is followed by silence. But as far as a truth commission, as far as us acknowledging what we have done in Latin America, not a chance. So I do not ask of the inferior Latin Americans to do, and yet they have. And that's the point. They actually have.
Have a question?
Yeah, that was a question.
Well, I have a question.
No, I'm sorry. I just got so.
No, it's a very, very fair point. I mean, I would tell you that I find it in many ways. The questions that were asked about does this solve things if you deal with this? But I'm quite admiring of Latin Americans going through this process. I just wish that people in the United States would at least be aware that they're going through this process. I mean, I can obviously point to people, both Democrats and Republicans, simply denying what happened. President Reagan continually referred to so-called atrocities in Argentina. One of the reasons the House of Representatives blocked the release of documents is going to show, because you can find the documents now in the Public Record Office, about the question of the Malvinas, with President Reagan on the phone with Margaret Thatcher pleading the Argentine case, with Jeane Kirkpatrick pleading the Argentine case. And I simply can point out to you that some of the things that President Nixon said about Latin Americans are just simply beyond the pale. So all I can say is that as an historian, it is my job. I'm glad that Lars point. I feel very flattered that he read that. But I can say it's my job. I don't have, as an historian, I don't have a cure for cancer. I can't. All I can do is try to bring the facts out to people, and to speak in a way that educated people, not to engage in academic cant and academic discourse that's so obscure, but rather simply to just try to get people engaged in the debate about what has happened here.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, please.
I wonder what you think about these ideas. What you described in terms of the United States' role in this period is fundamentally a supportive, anti-communistic, stability-seeking hegemon's role. Let's just have things the way we want them so we don't have to pay any attention to them. Then the question comes up, why did Latin Americans comply, or how did that come to be? What was the nature, social nature of the Latin American response? I guess from my experience living and working in Latin America and also in Spain, I guess I hearken to these thoughts that there's a lot of deep conservatism. You've been using the word right and left, and that's one way of putting it, but I think it might be better to put it that there is a deep conservatism, and then that conservatism, which emanated from the church, in part, working with the Spanish kings, then rolled over to its operational front, which was military, during this particular period that we're talking about. So it's about money in many ways. It is about land reform in many ways. I'll stop there. What do you think about all that?
Okay. Well, there's a very famous historian of Latin America by the name of Thomas Skidmore, who's an expert on Brazil, who often makes the point that any historian who's studying Latin America who de-emphasizes the role of conservative thought in Latin America is making a mistake. Okay. Having said that, I think part of the kind of turmoil that's occurring in Latin America in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s is that the traditional trinity of oligarchy, the military, the landed elite,
and the church, that one pillar of that had changed, being the church. After the Bishops' Conference that made the end in 1968, and the growth of liberation theology, and then you get large numbers of American missionaries coming to Latin America, I think that creates an enormous amount of change in Latin America and demand for change. When you read Richard Nixon about Roman Catholics in Latin America, when you listen to some of the tape conversations, which he's calling them all Catholics, and Nixon says, I'm not a Catholic, but I'm a bigger Catholic than most Catholics. He says something like that, and that all of these church people, that they're just communists, and we have to stop them, and he orders some detailed studies of a variety of church people, etc. So the church, the change in the church brings things. Now, one of the initial things here, of course, in U.S. policy, the United States wants good things for Latin America. The United States wants democracy and anti-communism. Those who hold power in Latin America, the landed elite and the military, they understand that the most sensitive nerve in the United States is to use the communism charge and to charge opponents as being communists, knowing that it would always hit a sensitive nerve in the United States. And so it's a complicated sort of situation here, but that becomes a very, very powerful appeal. And so Latin American elites use the term communism for their own to strengthen their own power.
Thank you. Our camera person wants to ask a little question as well, which is complicated because I now have to go to the camera.
Hi. Thank you for your talk. I had one question about the role of Latin Americans in all of this violence, because we talked a lot about culpability, individual culpability, and I think I kind of want to ask a two-part question about, first, if you could talk a little bit more about the role of maybe right-wing or elite dissidents, for example, the women who are banging pots and pans outside of La Moneda in Chile to kind of foment coups. And also, I wonder if you could speak to kind of how graduate students might create a balance of structural issues, U.S. involvement, versus domestic issues.
Thank you.
Very good. Okay. Well, Professor Schoultz asked me, what are future historians and younger historians going to think about our work? One of the things that they're going to raise is that I'm not giving enough agency to Latin Americans. And I think that's where you're getting with the question of agency. Well, if you look at the killing zone, I never say the United States did any of this. I said it aided and abetted. So the agency is with those who carry out this. And I think it's very important to study all the variety. There's a new edited collection of essays trying to give agency to Latin Americans during the Cold War, edited by Virginia Garrard Burnett and Mark Lawrence, trying to give more agency to Latin Americans. And of course, when you raise the issue, for example, I'll give you a good example, is the Central Intelligence Agency in massively intervening in the 1964 election in Chile, in which the United States spent several $1 million to ensure that Eduardo Frei, a decent Democrat, won, and that Salvador Allende was defeated. They understood that Chilean women were very conservative. And so enormous amount of money was spent on organizing Chilean women to vote, and all kinds of, the CIA created all kinds of women's groups to encourage women to vote, emphasizing that if Allende was elected, the Chilean family would be destroyed, etc. So there you get a kind of interesting both agency of Chilean women and also the role of the United States, and a very interesting and sophisticated understanding by the CIA of the kind of dynamics of Chilean society. And I think that any person who doesn't recognize that Latin Americans are capable of acting on their own and pursuing their own objectives is writing poor history. In addition, going back to the previous question, sometimes the tail wags the dog. Latin Americans are very sophisticated at manipulating the United States. By using these terms about communism and what might happen if the other side wins, etc. And the United States often falls for that type of manipulation. So it's a very, very dynamic process, and I think some of the newer historians are really giving kind of both sides of this because they have access to Latin American archival sources.
Thank you. We have time for one short question.
Several years ago in the 80s, I remember someone had visited South America, and his comment was that he had stayed with a wealthy family and said that they were terrified of the people who were not wealthy. They were going to take what they had. And I was wondering if you would care to...
Thank you.
I could used to say that Latin America was, a deeply unequal society, more unequal than the United States. That, of course, is no longer true. The United States being one of the most unequal societies. But there are long-standing issues of the distribution of power in Latin America, power both politically, economically, socially, culturally, and of course there is struggle and debate over these. A key issue is that frequently this struggle and debate was carried out in constitutional terms, whether it be in Guatemala in 1954, in Chile in 1973, in Brazil in 1964. These issues were being debated within constitutional terms. But in those three particular cases, those who did not want change asked for U.S. assistance in overthrowing constitutional governments. There is no doubt that the Chilean military, it wasn't just that the United States found General Pinochet. General Pinochet sought out the United States. The forces of the right in Guatemala sought out the United States. Brazilian generals sought out the United States in 1964. It's a mutual thing, posing as their opponents as being communist, even though the debate over power and the transfer of power and the distribution of power was being carried out by a constitutional means.
Thank you. I think we have to thank you very much for a very enlightening. Professor Schoultz, it really was a pleasure to have you here. Please come back sometime in the future. And before you all storm out, I would like to point out that we do have a film on Monday evening at 6 p.m. in the Mandela Auditorium. That film is about Argentina's dirty war in the late 70s and early 1980s. It's about the missing grandchildren. And the director and producer is here, and Hodin Carter will be there, who spoke before, to comment on the film. So I would like to welcome all of you at 6 p.m. in the Mandela Auditorium this coming Monday. And the next talk here in our lecture series will be on the 24th of February, and this time it will be Federica Bindi from the University of Rome in Italy, talking about the current state and future of Europe as an international player or not. You're welcome to come to this talk as well, and thank you very much for coming tonight. Good evening.